My name is Elena, and I'm 56 years old. For as long as I can remember, my days have been predictable. Early mornings with tea by the window, afternoons spent tending to my garden or browsing through old books, and evenings that often felt like echoes of the ones before. My life was quiet, perhaps too quiet, but I'd grown used to it. After all, at my age, isn't it better to settle into comfort than chase after impossible dreams? It was a Thursday, one of those crisp autumn days when the air carries the faint scent of falling leaves. I had decided to treat myself to a morning coffee at a small cafe near the park. It was my little indulgence, a break from my routine. The cafe was cozy, with warm wooden tables and the gentle hum of conversations blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. I had just settled into my usual corner seat, stirring sugar into my coffee, when I noticed him. He walked in, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark, unruly hair and an easy grace that made every movement seem deliberate. There was a warmth to his smile as he greeted the barista, a genuine kindness that felt rare. I told myself to look away, but I couldn't. There was something about him that held me captive. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, or the quiet confidence in his gaze. Whatever it was, it stirred something within me, a flicker of curiosity, of longing, of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. He took a seat by the window, just a few tables away from mine, and pulled out a book. I found myself stealing glances, my heart racing every time I thought he might catch me. What was I doing? I hadn't felt this way since I was a girl, and here I was, a woman well into her 50s, acting like a love-struck teenager. But I couldn't help it. As I watched him, sipping my coffee in slow, deliberate gulps, I felt a strange pull. I wanted to know more about him, who he was, what he liked, why he seemed so familiar despite being a stranger. When he left the cafe, I hesitated for a moment before following him. I told myself it was just a walk, a chance to clear my head, but deep down I knew better. I watched him from a distance as he strolled through the park, pausing now and then to observe the changing leaves or exchange a smile with a passing stranger. For the first time in years, my world didn't feel so small. For the next 3 days, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't fully understand. Each morning, I'd return to the cafe, hoping to see him again. And each time, he was there, seated by the window with a book in hand, his coffee steaming beside him. I wasn't proud of it, but I followed him. Not too closely, always careful to stay out of sight. I told myself it was harmless curiosity, but the truth was, I was captivated. I learned his habits, how he lingered in the park after finishing his coffee, how he always stopped at a flower stall to admire the bouquets but never bought one, how he'd occasionally pull out a sketch pad and draw with an intensity that made the world around him fade away. I wasn't sure what I was searching for. Perhaps some explanation for why I felt this way. Was it his youth? His charm? Or was it simply that he seemed so at ease with the world, while I felt like I'd spent years hiding from it? On the third day, something shifted. I was seated at my usual table, pretending to read a book I hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. He walked in, his eyes scanning the room, and for a fleeting moment, they locked with mine. I felt my breath catch, my cheeks warming under his gaze. He smiled, just a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it was enough to send my heart racing. As he took a seat by the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had noticed me. The way he glanced in my direction every so often, the way his smile lingered just a second too long when our eyes met, it felt like more than coincidence. Later that day, I saw him in the park, seated on a bench with his sketchpad. I stayed hidden behind a tree, watching as he scribbled furiously, his brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, he looked up, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he had spotted me. But instead of searching the crowd, his eyes landed on a couple walking by, a man and woman, their fingers intertwined, their laughter carrying on the breeze. He smiled, a wistful, almost tender expression that seemed to hint at a quiet yearning of his own. It was then that I realized he wasn't as untouchable as I'd thought. Beneath his confident exterior, there was something vulnerable, something that mirrored the ache I had carried for so long. And just like that, my fear began to give way to hope. Perhaps I wasn't imagining things. Perhaps, in some strange, unexpected way, he had noticed me too. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't live in the shadows of my own hesitation any longer. The glances, the smiles, the fleeting moments that felt almost orchestrated by fate, they had to mean something, didn't they? That morning, I dressed with more care than I had in years. I chose a simple navy dress that hugged me just enough to feel confident, paired with a scarf that I hoped would bring out the color of my eyes. My hands trembled as I tied it, the gravity of what I was about to do settling heavily on me. At the cafe, I sat at my usual table, waiting. When he walked in, I felt that same electric pull I'd been fighting for days. He ordered his coffee, took his seat, and for a while, everything was as it had been. But then he looked at me. Really looked at me. The moment stretched, the air between us humming with unspoken words. I don't know where I found the courage, but I smiled at him, a shy, hesitant gesture that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. To my surprise, he smiled back. It was the invitation I needed. As he gathered his things to leave, I stood, my legs unsteady but determined. "Excuse me," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He turned, his expression curious, and for the first time, I saw him up close. His eyes were a rich, deep brown, warm and inviting. "Yes?" he said, tilting his head slightly. I've seen you here a few times," I began, my words faltering. "I was wondering if you might like to join me for a cup of coffee sometime." For a moment, he seemed taken aback, but then his lips curved into a smile. "How about now?" We sat together, and for the next hour, I felt like I was living someone else's life. We talked about books, about the cafe, about the changing seasons. His voice was calm, his laugh genuine, and every moment felt like peeling back a layer of a person I wanted to know. When we finally left the cafe, I hesitated at the door, my heart pounding. "Would you like to come over for dinner tonight?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile didn't waver. "I'd like that," he said. As I walked home, my mind raced with excitement and doubt. What would he think of me? Of my home? What would we even talk about? But beneath it all, there was a thrill I couldn't deny, a sense that this was a step I had been waiting to take for far too long. That evening, as I prepared a simple meal, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw someone alive with anticipation. Someone ready to take a chance. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of her. When he arrived at my door that evening, I was trembling inside. I opened it to find him standing there, a bottle of wine in his hand and a smile that was both confident and endearing. He was wearing a navy sweater that highlighted the warmth in his eyes, and for a moment, I felt like I was in a dream. "Come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He stepped inside, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both unfamiliar and thrilling. My home, usually so quiet and solitary, felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. I led him to the dining room, where the table was set with a modest meal, roast chicken, a fresh salad, and bread still warm from the oven. "This looks amazing," he said as he took his seat, his eyes scanning the table before landing on me. "Thank you for inviting me." We talked as we ate, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. He told me about his work as an illustrator, his love for quiet moments like the ones he spent sketching in the park. I shared pieces of myself I hadn't spoken about in years, my love for gardening, my collection of old records, and the life I had built for myself after my children had grown and moved away. There was a moment, halfway through the meal, when our hands brushed as we both reached for the wine bottle. I froze, my heart leaping, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made the air between us feel charged. After dinner, I offered to show him my garden. The night was cool, and the stars were bright against the dark sky. We walked among the rows of flowers and herbs, our conversation softer now, more intimate. "It's beautiful," he said, stopping to admire the roses. "It's peaceful, like you." I laughed, the sound shaky. I don't always feel peaceful, I admitted. He turned to me then, his expression serious. I think you're more than you realize, he said. The space between us seemed to shrink, the world narrowing until it was just the two of us. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady. Elena, he murmured, my name a soft reverence on his lips. I don't know who leaned in first, but when his lips met mine, it was as if time stopped. The kiss was tender and searching, a quiet exploration that quickly deepened. We returned inside, the warmth of his presence guiding me, steadying me. When he kissed me again, it was more certain, filled with a passion that left me breathless. Every touch, every glance, felt like peeling back years of doubt and fear, like rediscovering parts of myself I thought I had lost. That night, we shared more than just physical closeness. We shared pieces of our souls, moments of vulnerability that felt profound and unspoken. In his arms, I felt beautiful, seen, and cherished in a way I hadn't in years. It was as if I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, and now that it had arrived, I didn't want it to end. The soft glow of morning filtered through the curtains, casting golden light across the room. I lay awake, watching him sleep beside me, his breathing steady and calm. It felt surreal, as though I might wake up at any moment to find it had all been a dream. But the warmth of his hand, resting lightly over mine, reminded me it was real. For a long time, I simply watched him, replaying the events of the night before. I had expected to feel awkward or unsure, but instead, there was a quiet peace within me, a sense of rightness I hadn't known I needed. When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet mine, he smiled, and my heart skipped the way it had the first time I saw him at the cafe. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in the stillness of the morning. When he finally sat up, stretching with a lazy grace, he turned to me with a boyish grin. "I didn't expect this," he said, his tone warm and genuine. "Neither did I admitted, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Over coffee in the kitchen, the conversation turned reflective. We spoke about our fears, our hopes, and the strange paths that had led us to one another. He shared how he'd noticed me at the cafe long before I'd approached him, how he'd been drawn to the quiet confidence he saw in me. Confidence? I laughed, shaking my head. I was terrified. "You hit it well," he said with a chuckle, his eyes softening. "There's something about you, Elena. You're different from anyone I've met." His words, simple as they were, filled a space in me I hadn't realized was empty. For years, I had convinced myself that my time for love had passed, that my worth was tied to a version of myself I could never return to. But here he was, seeing me as I was now, and still finding something worth holding on to. As he prepared to leave, I walked him to the door, my heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. What would happen next? Was this a fleeting moment, or the start of something more? He seemed to sense my hesitation. "I'd like to see you again," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "If you'll have me." The warmth in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, it was all I needed to hear. I smiled, a small but hopeful curve of my lips. "I'd like that too," I replied. When he kissed me goodbye, it wasn't with the same urgency as the night before, but with a tenderness that promised more. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it, my heart full and my thoughts racing. Whatever this was, wherever it might lead, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to embrace it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself living in a way I hadn't in years, alive, awake, and present. Each moment with him felt like a step into the unknown, yet it never felt uncertain. The world around us seemed to fade, as if everything else had receded into the background, leaving only the two of us. We spent afternoons in the park, shared dinners in my little home, and talked for hours under the stars. There was an ease between us, a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. I marveled at the way we fit together, as though we were two halves of a whole, two people who had been searching for one another without even realizing it. And yet, in the quiet moments, doubt would creep in. Was I being foolish? Was I just chasing a fleeting fantasy, clinging to something that couldn't last? But then, I would look at him, at the way he looked at me, at the way he made me feel, and I would remember why I had dared to take this leap. We were not bound by age, or the years that separated us. We were bound by something far stronger, the simple, undeniable truth that we had found each other, against all odds. As I stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about love and what it truly meant. It wasn't about the timing or the judgments of others. It was about connection, about allowing yourself to be seen for who you really are and being brave enough to reach out and say, "I'm here, and I'm willing to try." Love had never felt so full, so real. I had spent years believing that love was something for the young, for the unscarred, for those who hadn't yet experienced the trials of life. But now I understood differently. Love was for anyone who dared to reach for it, to open their heart without fear, and to embrace the possibility of something beautiful, no matter the shape it took. As I looked back on everything that had led me to this moment, I realized that this unexpected romance had been more than just a spark. It had been a transformation. I had rediscovered a part of myself I had forgotten. The quiet, routine life I had once known seemed far away now, replaced by something far richer. I had found love again. Not the love of youth, but the love of a woman who had learned to embrace life fully, without hesitation. And in his arms, I knew I was no longer the person I had been before. I was someone new, someone bold enough to believe in second chances, in unexpected moments, and in a love that defied every expectation.